Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a source that makes a pretty bold claim that the United States isn't just a country. It's actually an empire.
So, the source we're looking at kicks things off with a really powerful idea. It says that the map of the US that we all know, the one you see in every classroom, it's wrong. Or maybe more accurately, it's incomplete. It's hiding a much bigger story about American power.
And that right there leads us to the central question of this whole analysis. If that standard map isn't the full picture, then what is the United States really?
Okay, so to make its case, the source starts with a very specific definition of an empire, and then it lays out its evidence, arguing that the U.S. fits this definition in three key ways. So let's break them down one by one.
All right, the first piece of the argument zeroes in on something that's surprisingly straightforward: direct territorial control. Yeah, we're talking about actual land and actual people living under U.S. rule that you just don't see on your typical map.
The source shows this fascinating comparison. On one side, you have the map we all know. On the other, a map it calls the Greater U.S. from back in 1941. And boom, suddenly the picture just explodes to include this huge network of overseas territories.
And we're not just talking about a few tiny islands here. This was a massive collection of territories, everything from the Philippines all the way to Puerto Rico. And what's really interesting is that the source points out most of these places, they're still under some form of U.S. rule even today.
Get this, back in the 1940s, a whopping 19 million people lived in these territories. Now, to put that into perspective, that means about 1 out of every 8 people under U.S. rule was living outside of the mainland states. That's a lot.
And then, after the occupations following World War II, that number just exploded. The source claims there were actually more people living under American rule outside the mainland than inside it. I mean, think about that. That's a scale of control that completely rewrites the whole story of America's borders.
Okay, so that brings us to the second pillar of the argument. According to the source, the U.S. eventually made a big shift in strategy, away from directly holding territory and towards projecting military power across, the entire globe.
So the argument here is that while the U.S. did give some colonies their independence, like the Philippines, for example, it was simultaneously building a new, much more subtle form of control, a permanent, worldwide network of military bases.
And today, the source estimates that the United States maintains roughly 800 military bases in foreign countries all around the world.
And this chart, wow, it really puts the sheer scale of that military footprint into perspective. You can see it right there. The source claims the U.S. has about 800 overseas bases. Now look at the other bar. That's every other nation on Earth, combined. They have only about 30. The difference is just staggering.
Now, according to the source, these bases aren't just for defense. It claims their real purpose is to keep pretty much every country on the planet aligned with U.S. political and corporate interests. Whether that means protecting resources or being ready to launch interventions.
And to back up that specific claim, the video points to this pretty direct admission from former National Security Advisor John Bolton. He's on TV openly stating that he has, in fact, helped plan coups in other countries.
It also highlights this moment with a former CIA director, James Woolsey. He was asked, straight up, if the U.S. has meddled in other countries' elections. His answer? Oh, probably. And he justified it by saying it was all to stop communists from taking power.
All right, that brings us to the third and final pillar of the argument. This one shifts away from military force and focuses on economic power, which the source claims the U.S. uses as yet another tool of imperial control.
The source lays out this 3-step economic strategy that was put in place after World War II. The claim is that the U.S. used its massive influence over institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, the ones that lend money to developing nations, to basically build a global economic system that works in favor of American corporations. And what was the result of that strategy? Well, here you go. The source says that by 2012, U.S. companies owned almost half of all the shares in the world's top 500 corporations. And remember, the U.S. only has about 4% of the world's population. That's a huge disparity.
Okay, but a really crucial piece of this economic puzzle is the power of the U.S. dollar. The source highlights its special status as the world's global reserve currency. What does that mean? Well, it's the main currency used for international trade. Because essential things like oil are priced in dollars, pretty much every country has to hold and trade in dollars. And that gives American monetary policy a massive, direct impact on literally the entire global economy.
The source also talks about sanctions as a really powerful economic weapon. It notes that right now, the U.S. has over 15,000 active sanctions in place. And get this, they affect about a third of all the nations on the planet.
And the source uses some really stark language from an actual U.S. government memo to make its point. It argues that the human cost of these sanctions isn't some unfortunate side effect. No, it says it's the goal, to create desperation to try and force political change.
Okay, so let's pull all this together. We've got these three distinct threads: territory, military, and the economy. Let's see how they weave together to paint the full picture the source material is presenting.
So, to recap, the entire argument from the source really rests on these three pillars. It starts with a history of direct territorial control. That then evolves into an absolutely unmatched global military presence, and all of it is held up and reinforced by overwhelming economic power.
So in the end, the source's conclusion is that the United States isn't some grand exception to history. It's just a new kind of empire, using new tools. And that leaves us with the final big question the material wants us to think about. If this really is a modern empire, then what does its future look like?